Hello everyone, I hope you are very consistent. Welcome back and let's continue from where we left. Bitterness was caused by a number of things he came up against in his former hometown when, on his return, a man found that in many places he was met only with a shrug of shoulders and with hackneyed phrases. He tended to become bitter and to ask himself why he had gone through all that he had. When he heard the same phrases nearly everywhere, we did not know about it, and we too have suffered. Then he asked himself, have they really nothing better to say to me? The experience of disillusionment is different. Here, it was not one's fellow man whose superficiality and lack of feeling was so disgusting that one finally felt like creeping into a hole and neither hearing nor seeing human beings anymore, but fate itself, which seemed so cruel, a man who for years had thought he had reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering, now found that suffering has no limits, and that he could suffer still more and still more intensely. When we spoke about attempts to give a man in camp mental courage, we said that he had to be shown something to look forward to in the future. He had to be reminded that life still waited for him, that a human being waited for his return. But after liberation, there were some men who found that no one awaited them. Woe to him who found that the person whose memory alone had given him courage in camp did not exist anymore. Woe to him who, when the day of his dreams finally came, found it so different from all he had longed for. Perhaps he boarded a trolley, travelled out the home which he had seen for years in his mind, and only in his mind he pressed the bell, just as he has longed to do in thousands of dreams, only to find that the person who should open the door was not there and would never be there again. We all said to each other in camp that there could be no earthly happiness which could compensate for all we had suffered. We were not hoping for happiness. It was not that which gave us courage and gave meaning to our suffering, our sacrifices, and our dying, and yet we were not prepared for unhappiness. This delusionment, which awaited not a small number of prisoners, was an experience which these men have found very hard to get over and which for a psychiatrist is also very difficult to help them overcome. But this must not be a discouragement to him. On the contrary, it should provide an added stimulus. But for every one of the liberated prisoners, the day comes when, looking back on his camp experiences, he can no longer understand how he endured it all. As the day of his liberation eventually came, when everything seemed to him like a beautiful dream, so also the day comes when all his camp experiences seem to him nothing but a nightmare. The crowning experience of all for the homecoming man is the wonderful feeling that after all he has suffered, there is nothing he need fear anymore except his God. So, congratulations, everyone. We have completed 100 pages of this book and part 1 with this. Now we will be starting with the part 2. Logotherapy in a nutshell. So excited. Readers of my short autobiographical story usually ask for a fuller and more direct explanation of my therapeutic doctrine. Accordingly, I added a brief section of logotherapy to the original edition of From Death Camp to Existentialism. But that was not enough, and I have been designed beside by request for a more extended treatment. Therefore, in the present edition, I have completely rewritten and considerably expanded my account. The assignment was not easy. To convey to the reader within a short space all the material which required 20 volumes in German is an almost hopeless task. I am reminded of the American doctor who once turned up in my office in Vienna and asked me, "Now, doctor, are you a psychoanalyst?" Whereupon I replied, "Not exactly a psychoanalyst, let's say a psychotherapist." Then he continued questioning me, "What school do you stand for?" I answered, "It's my own theory. It is called logotherapy." "Can you tell me in one sentence what is meant by logotherapy?" he asked. "At least, what is the difference between psychoanalysis and logotherapy?" "Yes," I said, "but in the first place, can you tell me in one sentence what you think the essence of psychoanalysis is?" This was his answer. "During psychoanalysis, the patient must lie down on a couch and tell you things which sometimes are very disagreeable to tell." Whereupon I immediately retorted with the following improvisation. "Now, in logotherapy, the patient may remain sitting erect, but he must hear things which sometimes are very disagreeable to hear." Of course, this was meant facetiously and not as a capsule version of logotherapy. However, this is something in it, in as much as logotherapy, in comparison with psychoanalysis, is a method less retrospective and less introspective. Logotherapy focuses rather on future, that is to say, on the meanings to be fulfilled by the patient in his future. Logotherapy, indeed, is a meaning centered psychotherapy. At the same time, logotherapy defocuses all the vicious circle formations and feedback mechanisms which play such a great role in the development of neurosis. Thus, the typical self centeredness of the neurotic is broken up instead of being continually fostered and reinforced. To be sure, this kind of statement is an oversimplification. Yet, in logotherapy, the patient is actually confronted with and reoriented toward the meaning of his life. And to make him aware of this meaning, he contributes much to his ability to overcome his neurosis. Let me explain why I have employed the term logotherapy as a name for my theory. Logos is a Greek word which denotes meaning. Logotherapy, or as it has been called by some authors, the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, focuses on the meaning of human existence as well as on man's search for such a meaning. According to logotherapy, this striving to find a meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in man. That is why I speak of a will to meaning, in contrast to the pleasure principle, or as we could also term it, the will to pleasure, on which Freudian psychoanalysis is centered, as well as in contrast to the will to power on which Adlerian psychology, using the term striving for superiority, is focused. Man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life and not a secondary realization of instinctual drives. This meaning is unique and specific in that it must and can be fulfilled by him alone. Only then does it achieve a significance which will satisfy his own will to meaning. There are some authors who contend that meanings and values are nothing but defense mechanisms, reaction formations, and sublimations. But as for myself, I would not be willing to live merely for the sake of my defense mechanisms, nor would I be ready to die merely for the sake of my reaction formations. Man, however, is able to live and even to die for the sake of his ideals and values. A public opinion poll was conducted a few years ago in France. The result showed that 89% of the people polled admitted that man needs something for the sake of which to live. Moreover, 61% conceded that there was something or someone in their own lives for whose sake they were even ready to die. I repeated this poll at my hospital department in Vienna among both the patients and the personnel, and the outcome was practically the same as Among the thousands of people screened in France, the difference was only 2%. Another statistical survey of 7,948 students at 48 colleges was conducted by social scientists from Johns Hopkins University. Their preliminary report is part of a 2 year study sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health. Asked what they considered very important to them now. 16% of the students checked making a lot of money. 78% said their first goal was finding a purpose and meaning to my life. Of course, there may be some cases in which an individual's concern with values is really a camouflage of hidden inner conflicts. But if so, they represent the exceptions from the rule rather than the rule itself. In these cases, we have actually to deal with pseudo values, and as such, they have to be unmasked. Unmasking, however, should stop as soon as one is confronted with what is authentic and genuine in man. Example, man's desire for a life that is as meaningful as possible. If it does not stop, then the only thing that the unmasking psychologist really unmasks is his own hidden motive, namely his unconsciousness need to debase and depreciate what is genuinely human in man. Existential, existential frustration. Man's will to meaning can also be frustrated, in which case logotherapy speaks of existential frustration. The term existential may be used in three ways to refer to first, existence itself, that is, the specifically human mode of being. Second, the meaning of existence. And third, the striving to find a concrete meaning in personal existence. That is to say, the will to meaning. Existential frustration can also result in neurosis. For this type of neurosis, logotherapy has coined the term monogenic neurosis, in contrast to neurosis in the traditional sense of the word, that is psychogenic neurosis. Monogenic neurosis have their origin not in the psychological, but rather in the neurological, from the Greek nous meaning mind dimension of human existence. There is another logotherapeutic term which denotes anything pertaining to the specifically human dimension. Neogenic neurosis Neogenic neurosis do not emerge from conflicts between drives and instincts, but rather from existential problems. Among such problems, the frustration of the will to meaning plays a large role. It is obvious that in neogenic cases, the appropriate and adequate therapy is not psychotherapy in general, but rather logotherapy, a therapy that is which dares to enter the specifically human dimension. Let me quote the following instance. A high ranking American diplomat came to my office in Vienna in order to continue psychoanalytic treatment, which he had begun 5 years previously with an analyst in New York. At the outset, I asked him why he thought he should be analyzed, why his analysis had been started in the first place. It turned out that the patient was discontented with his career and found it most difficult to comply with American foreign policy. His analyst, however, had told me again and again that he should try to reconcile himself with his father because the government of the US as well as his superiors were nothing but father images, and consequently his dissatisfaction with his job was due to the hatred he unconsciously harbored toward his father. Through an analysis lasting 5 years, the patient had been promoted more and more to accept his analyst's interpretations until he finally was unable to see the forest of reality for the trees of symbols and images. After a few interviews, it was clear that his will to meaning was frustrated by this vocation, and he actually longed to be engaged in some other kind of work. As there was no reason for not giving up his profession, and embarking on a different one, he did so, with most gratifying results. He has remained contented in this new occupation for over 5 years, as he recently reported. I doubt that. In this case, I was dealing with a neurotic condition at all, and that is why I thought that he did not need any psychotherapy, nor even logotherapy, for the simple reason that he was not actually a patient. Not every conflict is necessarily neurotic. Some amount of conflict is normal and healthy. In a similar sense, suffering is not always a pathological phenomenon, rather than being a symptom of neurosis. Suffering may well be a human achievement, especially if the suffering grows out of existential frustration. I would strictly deny that one search for a meaning to his existence or even his doubt of it in every case is derived from or results in any disease. Existential frustration is in itself neither pathological nor pathogenic. A man's concern, even his despair over the worthwhileness of life, is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. It may well be that interpreting the first in terms of the later motivates a doctor to bury his patient existential despair under a heap of tranquilizing drugs. It is his task, rather, to pilot the patient through his existential crisis of growth and development. Logotherapy regards its assignment as that of assisting the patient to find meaning in his life. Inasmuch as logotherapy makes him aware of the hidden logos of his existence, it is an analytical process. To this extent, logotherapy resembles psychoanalysis. However, in logotherapy's attempt to make something conscious again, it doesn't restrict its activity to instinctual facts within the individual's unconsciousness, but also cares for existential realities such as the potential meaning of his existence to be fulfilled as well as his will to meaning. Any analysis, however, even when it refrains from including the neurological dimension in its therapeutic process, tries to make the patient aware of what he actually longs for in the depth of his being. Logotherapy deviates from psychoanalysis is insofar as it considers man a being whose main concern consists in fulfilling a meaning, rather than in the mere gratification and satisfaction of drives and instincts, or in merely reconciling the conflicting claims of id, ego, and superego, or in the mere adaptation and adjustment to society and environment. New dynamics. To be sure, man's search for meaning may arouse inner tension rather than inner equilibrium. However, precisely such tension is an indispensable prerequisite of mental health. There is nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would be so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life. There is much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. I can see in these words a motto which holds true for any psychotherapy. In the Nazi concentration camps, one could have witnessed that those who knew that there was a task waiting for them to fulfill were most apt to survive. The same conclusion has since been reached by other authors of books on concentration camps and also by psychiatric investigations into Japanese, North Korean, and North Vietnamese prisoner of war camps. As for myself, when I was taken to the concentration camp of Auschwitz, a manuscript of mine ready for publication was confiscated. Certainly, my deep desire to write this manuscript anew helped me to survive the rigors of the camp I was in. For instance, when in a camp in Bavaria I fell ill with typhus fever, I jotted down on little scraps of papers many notes intended to enable me to rewrite the manuscript. Should I live to the day of liberation, I am sure that this reconstruction of my lost manuscript in the dark barracks of Bavarian concentration camp assisted me in overcoming the danger of cardiovascular collapse. Thus, it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension, the tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between one is or the gap between what one is and what one should become. Such a tension is inherent in the human being and therefore is indispensable to mental well being. We should not then be hesitant about challenging man with a potential meaning for him to fulfill. It is only thus that we evoke his will to meaning from its states of latency. I consider it a dangerous misconception of mental hygiene to assume that what man needs in the first place is equilibrium, or as it's called in biology, homeostasis, that is, a tensionless state. What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. What he needs is not the discharge of tension at any cost, but the call of a potential meaning waiting to be fulfilled by him. What man needs is not homeostasis, but what I call not dynamic, no dynamics, that is the existential dynamics in a polar field of tension where one pole is represented by a meaning that is to be fulfilled and the other pole by the man who has to fulfill it. And one should not think that his holds true only for normal condition. In neurotic individuals, it is even more valid. If architects want to strengthen a decrepit arch, they increase the load which is laid upon it, for thereby the parts are joined more firmly together. So, if therapists wish to foster their patients' mental health, they should not be afraid to create a sound amount of tension through a reorientation toward the meaning of one's life. Having shown the beneficial impact of meaning orientation, I turn to the detrimental influence of that feeling of which so many patients complain today, namely the feeling of the total and ultimate meaninglessness of their lives. I hope you enjoyed and read this. Thank you. We will continue in the next video.